On the 13th of November 2023, while hanging out with a friend in a park in Wolverhampton, West Midlands, 19-year-old Shawn Seesahai crossed paths by pure coincidence with two 12-year-old boys. Moments later, his heart was penetrated by a 17-inch long MACHETE, which had been plunged into his back by one of the two said boys. That STAB was in fact so forceful, penetrating Mr. Seesahai's upper body as it did by all of 23 centimetres, that the weapon very nearly came out the other side. The STAB to Mr. Seesahai's skull was, likewise, so violent that a piece of bone came away. Mr. Seesahai's legs were also hacked at. The bladed article, though, wasn't the only thing used on the victim in this thoroughly vicious attack. While one boy chopped away at Mr. Seesahai with the MACHETE, the other kicked, punched and stamped on the victim. Although CPR was subsequently administered to Mr. Seesahai at the scene, Mr. Seesahai never made it. Mr. Seesahai's friend had taken flight when, on seeing one of the boys get his MACHETE out, Mr. Seesahai himself had ordered him to flee. In court for their trial, which concluded in June 2024, the two boys were allowed to play with fidget spinner toys while giving evidence. They also sat in the main well of the court, rather say than in the dock or behind the bar table like other defendants who were in custody. Sitting with them were both a family member and court intermediaries. These latter parties were there to explain the proceedings to the boys. The barristers and the judge didn't wear either wigs or gowns. At their sentencing hearing, which took place on the 27th of September 2024, the judge, Mrs. Justice Tipples, again didn't wear either her wig or her gown. Both boys got 8 years and 6 months. For each boy, this term was due to be reduced by the 315 days that, at the time of their sentencing, each had already spent in custody. Despite the fact that the two boys were convicted of rder in June 2024, they still, as yet, can't be named. I'm calling boy 1 John and boy 2 Steve. Be sure to subscribe, give the video a like and drop a comment. That will mean a lot to me. Not wanting to risk having this video age restricted is why I'm disguising certain words. What led up to this vicious unaliving and why did John and Steve do it? The respective background of each boy may hold the answers. Sometime before the events of the 13th of November 2023, John had been referred to mental health services on account of his history of self-harm. His diagnosis of ADHD, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, came in 2022. His underdeveloped emotional literacy and his substantial lack of maturity are just two of his many complex needs.
I have also been provided with and have read the report of a consultant clinical psychologist in relation to the first defendant. That report also explains that the first defendant is particularly vulnerable and immature, identifies further diagnosed disorders beyond ADHD, and explains that his verbal reasoning abilities are equivalent to those of a 10-year-old.
John's life had been an endless journey of change, loss and unpredictability, while domestic violence was an evil that he had suffered for many years. By the time of John's offence, he was being cared for entirely by his grandmother, the story of his parents being one that I simply can't trace. Most disturbingly of all, however, is that John was a victim of grooming, exploitation and modern slavery at the hands of older men in his local community. What I can't tell you is what those men were grooming John for, or, similarly, what the nature of their exploitation of him was, or, similarly again, what the nature of his slave labour was. Likewise, I can't say whether the police ever received a complaint relating to the matter of John's being groomed, whether from the boy's grandmother or from any other parties, like, for instance, John's school. If the police ever did receive any such complaint, I don't know what action, if any, they took. While he had no prior convictions, John was known to the police as someone who carried knives. Once again, I've got no further details on how the police responded, if at all, to this matter. What is patently clear, however, is that all the harrowing life experience that I've mentioned played, unsurprisingly, an important part in the acts that John committed against Mr. Seesahai on the night of the 13th of November 2023. As regards boy 2, who I'm calling Steve, like John, Steve had, before the events of the 13th of November 2023, suffered a notable level of instability in his life. His family had moved several times and had, at one point, stayed in a refuge. That, however, appears to be where the similarity between the two boys ends. Steve comes from a loving home with notably healthy family dynamics. He wasn't known to either police or social services and was, at one point, awarded the title of Student of the Year at his school. Having no mental health issues, his maturity level at the time of his offence was not below his chronological age. While the boy has shown remorse for his crimes, we're told, we're no less left with the question of what got into him on the night that he and John jointly unalived Mr. Seesahai. I'm under the impression, in fact, that Steve is the one who shoulder-barged Mr. Seesahai, as I'm about to detail, since he's described as being, quote, physically mature, unquote, which I personally take to mean quite tall and quite well built. What exactly unravelled on the 13th of November 2023 between John and Steve and their victim, a much-loved son and brother who had come over to the UK from Anguilla earlier that year to have his cataracts treated and to study? A month before committing the rder, John bought a machete from a friend of his for £40. Given what we now know of John's background, this might well revile and disgust us, but it probably won't shock us, although of course it still could. We also don't know exactly why he bought the thing. In any event, having acquired it, he kept it hidden under his bed. On coming home from school on the 13th of November 2024, he changed out of his uniform and put on a tracksuit. It is likely that this is when he picked up his machete and snapped a picture of himself posing with it, and then sent that snap to a friend of his, a girl. This is something that he did a few hours before unaliving Mr. Seesahai, you understand. Concealing his weapon, John then went out to meet a school friend of his, Steve. The two then met up with some other friends and headed to Stow Lawn playing fields, where they remained until after 8 p.m. Mr. Seesahai and his friend, meanwhile, had, before the arrival of John, Steve and their friends, been hanging out at the same place. Their plans for Christmas had been what they chatted about while sitting on a bench in that place. Having gone away from there at around 8:15 p.m, they subsequently returned in the hope of sitting back on the bench. However, they found a group of school kids sitting there, 2 boys and 2 girls. Mr. Seesahai asked the group to move. He may well have had no right to do so, but he hardly deserved the death penalty for doing so. One of the boys, who, as I say, I'm guessing was Steve, responded to Mr. Seesahai by getting up and shoulder-barging him. When Mr. Seesahai asked the group what they were doing, one boy, who had to have been John I'd say, got his machete out. After performing, together with Steve, the acts that caused Mr. Seesahai's unaliving, John went home with his weapon in tow and took the trouble of washing the weapon with bleach and then hiding it back under his bed. John and Steve were both arrested the very next day. Not since the shocking rder of 2-year-old James Bulger in 1993 by 2 10-year-olds have we had in the UK an unaliving committed by individuals aged 12 or under.
Good evening. Within 24 hours of the conviction of the 2 11-year-olds who murdered James Bulger, a row has broken out.
The James Bulger case horrified Britain. Robert Thompson and John Venables were 11 when they were convicted of murder, and the 2 boys who killed Shawn are the youngest murderers since this case in 1993.
It is not known with certainty which of John and Steve dealt the fatal 23-centimetre deep stab wound to Mr. Seesahai.
I'm sure from the nature of these injuries that the defendants intended to kill Shawn. They acted together to do so, although I cannot be sure which one inflicted the fatal stab wound.
Having blamed each other for the unaliving, furthermore, the boys themselves offered no reliable testimony. We might all jump to the obvious conclusion and say it was John, but, according to the judge, this was not proven beyond reasonable doubt. This means that, in reality, one of the 2 boys isn't an unaliver, but was no less found guilty of the offence of unaliving. I believe that the legal justification for convicting both boys of rder without determining which of them dealt the fatal blow is that the boys shared both the physical act of unaliving and the intention to either unalive or cause serious harm. This principle comes from the case of the Crown versus Joggy 2016. Being released on licence, which is what happens to most prisoners, means being subject to certain rules and restrictions. Breaking those rules and restrictions can get you sent back inside. In most cases, the rules and restrictions are only temporary. The phrase detention during His Majesty's pleasure means a mandatory life sentence for someone under 18.
I have explained that the only sentence I can pass on the defendants is detention during His Majesty's pleasure.
While a life term is rarely a matter of literally spending the rest of one's life in prison, one such person will be on licence forever if and when he or she is released. In setting the minimum term for John and Steve, since they weren't, as I implied, going to be locked up forever, Mrs Tipple, like all judges, had to follow some strict rules. Mrs Tipple is required to consider not only what acts John and Steve each committed, but also their personal circumstances and life experiences. There is, in fact, a list of exactly what she has to take into account.
I am required to undertake this exercise by reference to the Sentencing Council guidelines sentencing children and young people. This guideline identifies in detail the very many important considerations and factors that I am required to take into account.
Mrs Tipple's analysis of the respective life experiences of John and Steve are, as you've probably gathered, my own source of this information. The aggravating and mitigating factors respectively that should be applied to the sentencing decision, these being the final 2 points that the judge has to consider, were notably limited in number but no less significant.
I also have to look at the list of aggravating and mitigating factors set out in Schedule 21. There is some aggravation because this was an attack by 2 people, but the relevant mitigating factors are the lack of premeditation and the age of the defendants, all of which I have taken into account.
The 8 years and 6 months that John and Steve each got covers their respective convictions for possession of a bladed article in a public place. They got no separate penalty for that. On the topic of remorse, John basically says that he wishes he could turn the clock back.
The report also explains that the first defendant has spoken about what he did, that he said it is not fair that someone lost their life, and he feels sad about it. He said he feels bad that he took the knife out with him, and he wished things had gone differently.
Steve too wishes he'd made very different choices on the night of the 13th of November 2023.
The report explains that the second defendant expressed that he feels remorse for what happened, and he feels sorry for Shawn's family and understands that they are suffering greatly having lost their son.
Contradictorily enough though, in his pre-sentencing report, Steve was assessed as having, at the time of the report, a medium risk of reoffending and a high risk of harming others. For his part, in his own pre-sentencing report, John was assessed as having, again at the time of his report, a high risk of both reoffending and causing serious harm to others. That said, the respective report on each boy says that their behaviour during the time on remand has been good. John is engaging with important rehabilitative work.
He is now in a safe place where people will help him, and he has undertaken meaningful work which is helping him to make positive changes to his thoughts and behaviours. They are hopeful that his secure placement will result in further reducing his risks in the future.
The same goes for Steve.
The report then says that it's important that he continues to engage with the support and interventions where he's living, as that will give him something positive for his long-term future. The authors of the report accept the serious nature of the offences and what the second defendant has done, but comment very positively on his behaviour since he's been on remand, his motivation to do well and to achieve qualifications.
John is said to be in a safe place. Steve is said to be living at his place of remand. These references make it seem as if the secure unit where each had been held prior to their sentencing was a cosy, comfortable home, minus, of course, the freedom to leave. If that is the case, then that just isn't justice, I'd say. Having been sentenced, the boys will now pass into youth detention to serve their time. How different that will be to the secure unit, I can't say. Young offenders are subject to a far more substantial programme of rehabilitation than older offenders.
It's because our prisons at the moment are terrible, terrible places. They're lawless, they're violent, they're destructive. And you know, I take the case of Thompson and Venables as very illustrative of this point. We know with John Venables, for example, that having been released from prison custody, he's behaved abysmally and has been returned to prison custody. Robert Thompson is slightly different though, and the way that we deal with young people when we incarcerate them as young people is very much focused in the first instance on rehabilitation, on education, on trying to kind of deal with and address those problems that were likely there within them before we put them into an adult state, and seeing if we can get them to a stage where they're not going to reoffend again.
Mr Seesahai's parents feel that the sentence given to their son's unalivers is too short.
Whilst they recognise that 3 young lives have been destroyed, they alone have lost their son forever, and they do not feel that the sentence reflects the loss they have suffered daily since their son was murdered. They feel that if low sentences are given, it will not deter others from carrying knives. This is now a social crisis. Children carrying knives must be addressed by everyone, so Shawn's life was not taken in vain. It takes a village to raise a child.
Life for Mr Seesahai's parents has, very sadly, changed forever.
Suresh and Manishwari are haunted by thoughts of their son's final moments.
They murder him. They chop him, they chop his leg, they chop his shoulder, they beat him, they cuff him. They do a monstrous job. We wonder because he have to call for help. Daddy help me, mommy help me, because he's a kid.
When we cremate him, I told my husband, okay, we will bring him his ash right here and just lose it. You know, I know he will love that because he loved this beat.
If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.